Agreed to. I now call Chris Ockenvold.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I listened to the previous speaker with interest because this is a subject that has occupied an amount of time and discussion, particularly during the Resource Management Amendment Bill, the Simplifying and Streamlining Amendment Bill that passed through the Local Government and Environment Select Committee that I was heavily involved, along with all the other members of the committee, in the implementation of that Act. These Phase 1 reforms were considered carefully and we worked hard to get them right. And now, thanks to those changes, we have reduced a previously bureaucratic maze into something far more manageable, into something that instead of impeding progress will allow progress to take place, which I'd suggest, Mr. Speaker, was always the intention of the original Resource Management Act. What strikes me about this bill, and I have two concerns with it, one is that it is being done as an amendment and in isolation of other changes. But straight away, one of the concerns I have is that it could eventually be a step backwards rather than a step forwards, which I'm sure is the proposer's intention, that it does go forward. So please let me explain. Under the Act, requiring authorities are given the ability to have areas of land designated for use as network utilities or large public works. A requiring authority can be a Minister of the Crown, a local or regional authority, or a network utility operator approved by the Minister of the Environment. Currently, to become a requiring authority, a test of appropriateness is applied to applicants. An applicant may wish to carry out a project, work, or network utility operation. The work that the applicant wishes to carry out is covered by this test. One of the two main purposes, in my understanding of the Honourable Ruth Dyson's bill, changes the requirement of a project to be necessary rather than appropriate. Clearly, this could create a major roadblock for many projects. For a project to meet the requirements of a necessity test, the network utility operators would have to demonstrate that the project is the only viable option. Therein lies a problem, because it's not always the case. Even if it may be considered the best option, it may not be the only viable option. So this requirement would affect many regionally and nationally significant infrastructure projects. And these are some of the discussions that we had when we looked at this initially. This government wants to progress projects, not introduce legislation that in effect will hold them up. In other words, this bill could easily increase the red tape for no demonstrable gain and would in fact have negative consequences and would fail to achieve the laudable objective which no doubt inspired the member. Now, if we look at the second test, Mr. Speaker, currently this test is applied as to whether the applicant is likely to carry out the responsibilities of a requiring authority, including financial responsibilities, satisfactorily. This test also asks whether the applicant will have proper regard to the interests of those affected and to the interests of the environment. The second major purpose of Honourable Ruth Dyson's amendment bill is to require that the project, work or network utility operation be in the public interest. None of what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is to take away the reality that this is a difficult situation for any major works to deal with. But I would suggest that, again, the business of things having to be in the public interest seems excessive. From my analysis, the current situation covers the necessary requirements. Adding another criterion of having a, quote, public interest is going to rapidly be problematic. How does one define what the public interest is at any particular point in time and how long it will stay in exactly that position? It's another example of wanting to centralise things unnecessarily. It's not, Mr. Speaker, I contend, the government's job to determine public interest, and it is something that will be difficult to measure definitively. It would be, or could be, a field day for litigants. Essentially, Mr. Speaker, if we go down the path of forcing projects to be necessary rather than appropriate, combined with the requirement of being in the public interest, something whose subjectivity would be a nightmare to achieve consensus on, then the number of projects would be radically reduced. We will be impeding progress and increasing extra unnecessary criteria, which would increase the time delays we are trying to eliminate in reforms that this government is undertaking. We would potentially miss out on the benefits a project may provide locally, and that's jobs, services and potential for economic growth. It must also be noted that in Part 2 of the RMA reforms, and again this is not to lessen the intention of the proposer, but in Part 2 of the RMA reforms, to be instigated this year, work will be done on the designation provisions of the RMA. So this isn't just a matter of sour grapes saying it's being done anyway, because given that that work is already being done, is in conjunction with Tandem changes referring to the bill, to the Act, then there's no reason to contemplate such an amendment at this stage, to make an amendment in isolation. Indeed, I think if we were to do that, Mr. Speaker, we would risk unintended consequences occurring, and that's something that the RMA can certainly do without at the moment. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I see no reason whatsoever to introduce this legislation at the moment, and therefore I find it hard to support the Resource Management Requiring Authorities Amendment Bill, and we will not be doing so. The changes are strict, and let alone being without the commensurate benefits for such strictness, they will have a negative effect, in my view, on local economies. They'll prevent the viable best options for projects that don't fit within the narrow criterion of being necessary from going ahead, and simply it is not good legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.